Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Dr. Holly White. She's a cognitive psychologist and researcher at the University of Michigan, and we're going to be talking about what could be a very sensitive subject for some people, but an extremely interesting one for all of us. That is the link between ADHD and creativity. Dr. White, it's wonderful having you here today.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. So, Dr. White, for people who don't know about you, could you just give us a brief background as to where you got started and how you got to where you are now?
All right. Well, I would say I have always been interested in research. My background, education, and training is in cognitive psychology and understanding thought processes. And from the time I was in grad school, my thesis and dissertation research centered around ADHD in adults and creativity, memory, other types of cognitive processes. And in fact, what really brought my interest, I would say, to looking at creativity in particular is that when I studied some of the classic sorts of things like memory processes in adults with ADHD, I was interested in looking at some of the limitations and memory problems and this and that, the classics. And yet I was finding that people with ADHD tended to, when they did make errors, make very creative errors. And I thought, no, maybe there's something to this. There's something going on here. And so for my dissertation, I was very curious to see if I could look at this from a theoretical framework, really kind of get into the guts and the science of what might be going on here as far as creativity and ADHD.
Now, some people listening might be very aware of what ADHD is. They might even have family members who display some of the symptoms, but other people might not be as aware. Might even have some myths that they've heard about what ADHD is. So could you just give us a quick summary about what exactly ADHD is? What does it stand for? And what it's sort of, how it shows itself in people?
Okay. Well, it is the long version is Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, and sometimes people say ADD, just Attention Deficit Disorder. And it's a constellation of symptoms such as inattentiveness in a number of different contexts, sometimes impulsive or reckless behavior, and of course, motor hyperactivity, a lot of energy, that sort of thing. Those are predominantly the features that are associated with this. But the name has gone through a few evolutions. So in fact, used to be called hyperkinesis, and the reference again to the motor movement, and used to be something that would be diagnosed primarily in children, and it would be diagnosed on the basis of these kids being very energetic, bouncing off the walls. That's probably what most people are familiar with when they think of ADHD in children, is this sort of very hyper type of behavior. And in fact, that is one type of the classic ADHD or combined type, which has the symptoms of inattentiveness, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. And that affects about 5% of children. But we've also found too that it's a stable type of temperament or diagnosis. And so about 5% to up to, depending on how it's diagnosed, 10% or so, people will have this in adulthood as well. And if it's diagnosed in adults, it has to have been present during childhood as well for it to be valid. But you'll see the expression look a little bit different in adults, where you sometimes see the inattentiveness expressing itself as problematic in a work or social context rather than in the classroom.
I remember as well when I was younger, many years ago, there wasn't really this concept of ADHD. It seems to have become a lot more well-known and widespread over the last couple of decades.
Right.
So can I ask, if it's not too controversial a question, were people always sort of suffering from these symptoms, if we can call it suffering? Is this something that's just being diagnosed more often nowadays? Or is there something that is causing more and more people to develop these symptoms over time?
A good question. I would say there's a little of both going on. With respect to people not being diagnosed as frequently back in the day, I think that more and more diagnoses are happening now among adults when children are diagnosed, because there is a genetic component. And so sometimes people will bring their child in for a diagnosis and they'll think, gosh, I did that or do that, and maybe then refer or are referred for a diagnosis as well. I think too, there is increasing recognition of this as a disorder. And the many times people would not be referred necessarily for something like ADHD in the past, given that if it was expressed in a school context or at home and it wasn't a problem, or it was managed, perhaps things were more structured and it wasn't a problem, then a child that has ADHD would just kind of be under the radar, not be noticed. The newest conceptualization of ADHD in the latest DSM really talks about it in a way that has slightly looser criteria. And in fact, people were projecting that you might see higher incidence of ADHD, not so much that it's more frequent, but the diagnostic criteria are kind of loosening up a little bit to suggest that maybe more people could be included. One of the things that you find too, as far as stereotypes, that people think you got to be hyper. Well, more and more people are recognizing that there are inattentive subtypes where the high energy levels are not necessarily present. They're what I refer to as the daydreamers, the people who maybe will space out or be in their own thoughts and their minds are wandering, but they're not necessarily being disruptive. That tends to be more common in females. And it's just one of those that's a little bit more of a quiet thing. If a person's not creating a problem, they're likely not to be referred for a problem, and yet that type of thing tends to be recognized more and more when somebody is in a context that's challenging for them attentionally. So maybe college or a challenging job. I did say too, that it's possible that there is a bit more inattentiveness these days. And it seems that this is a bit controversial, but people are looking into the possible relationship between exposure to lots and lots of digital media and shortening attention spans. And it's hard to know, what's going on here, but there does seem to be a trend toward children being a bit less attentive, less likely to stay in place and focus on any one thing for longer periods of time. And of course, changes in children's exercise and activity levels and things like that are going to be moderating factors in how it's expressed. Among adults, it tends to be a little more stable. And if there are elevated levels of diagnosis, it's probably more that people are hearing more about it and becoming more informed and realizing it doesn't mean you have to be bouncing off the wall like a ping pong ball to be potentially having ADHD or ADD.
You mentioned that in some cases there's a genetic component. Is it always a genetic component? Is there a mixture between nature and nurture?
Yes, there is definitely both components. Not only is there nature and nurture, but you have, because ADHD is defined in terms of its behavioral manifestations, like people not sitting still or not being attentive and that sort of thing, the attentional impairments that could happen for other reasons may be labeled as attention deficit disorder because they fit the profile. And what I mean is that there are many types or primary types of ADHD or ADD that have a genetic component, and there are specific genes that have been associated with ADHD, and they tend to be passed on in the family. Usually one parent, or if not both, have ADHD if there is a child that's diagnosed. That said, attentional systems are very vulnerable to damage from any other thing. So if a child was, for example, malnourished or had a vitamin deficiency, or a transient thing like not getting enough sleep or not eating well, and that sort of thing, a lot of this can manifest as poor attention. And so it could be then diagnosed as ADHD, and it could create something that seems to be that sort of thing, a stable type pattern of energy imbalance and inattentiveness. But it isn't generally what we would think of as that sort of classic type of genetic condition that is a little bit more stable. And I've done a lot of research as well with children who are survivors of childhood cancer. And as a result of their chemotherapy and radiation treatments, there is a lot of attentional impairment, but it's different in terms of its biological origin. They have actual brain damage from some of the perforations and the brain connections made by these treatments. And then it looks as though it's ADHD, but it's like acquired rather than born with. And maybe the distinction is not terribly important, except there might be some differences in terms of how you would approach this. As somebody who has acquired attention deficits through some sort of injury, or even in terms of their environment, but too much digital stimulation or not enough sleep or too much sugar, that would be something that is potentially not going to be what I would focus on too in my research. It's not always going to be stable because there could be different underlying causes. It's not really what I would consider like a classic ADHD that has more of a genetic component and seems to have persisted evolutionary wise, for a long time.
Now let's get to this research. Obviously, you've done a lot of primary research with people with ADHD, and one of the reasons I contacted you today is some fascinating insights you gained on how these people perform on creativity tasks compared to the general population. What sort of research did you do, and what did you find as far as creative performance?
Okay, wow. Before I jump in, let me say too, with respect to creativity, I am not, of course, just talking about, so many times people think painting and music, or right away they'll think of creative arts. This was always the case when I talk about, creative people. I'm not creative, I can't draw. Well, that's just one tiny aspect of this. I tend to think of the creativity in terms of its classic definitions of producing ideas or products that are both novel or original and high in quality or fit or appropriateness. And so that's a very general definition and can apply, of course, to anything from an engineering product to a gorgeous painting to a radical idea or thought or movement. And so that creativity is a kind of a big thing. There's a whole lot of stuff that falls under that umbrella. There are also thought processes that contribute to creative behavior. And these are things like, even personality traits as well. Things like being open-minded, open to new experiences, a tendency to seek exposure to new things and take risks. A lot of these sorts of traits are pretty characteristic of ADHD, and so could potentially lend some fuel, to that creative spirit. But what I had started to look at specifically in my research was this idea that if inhibitory control, and that's with thought processes, your ability to sort of gate or control all the different ideas that come through to your consciousness, if that is something that by definition in ADHD is impaired, well, how might that translate into an expressive, creative idea? For example, if you are not filtering your thought processes, if you are potentially distracted by a lot of stuff in your environment, how might that stuff fuel all the different interactions and creative ideas that you have? And so in my early research, I did do a lot of things where I would combine measures of that ability to control or suppress different types of thoughts, and the likelihood that those things would thoughts would intrude, and how that might correlate to the uniqueness or originality of ideas that would be expressed in, say, divergent thinking tasks. And divergent thinking is a big part of creativity, because it just refers to having an idea that then diverges out in all different directions and branches out. So the idea is, it's that type of thought process that begins in one place and just kind of evolves and moves and changes. And so if you are thinking about a wandering mind or inattentive mind, it will start in one place and then it will kind of meander away. Well, in a creative thought process, you do the same type of thing where you have an idea and that idea evolves and it changes. And typically what we do to make sure that our mind doesn't run all over the place tangentially is we kind of rein it in as we go. And if you talk to someone about how to be more creative, they will often say, allow yourself to think, to brainstorm, to just come up with lots of ideas uncensored and then deal with them later, ideate. And that is something that comes very naturally and easy to people with ADHD, because they're not likely to be able to censor their thoughts anyway. And so you have essentially a bigger idea space. So what my early research suggested is there is this direct relationship between poor, what we call inhibitory control in ADHD, and the ability to produce ideas that are higher in originality and other features, for example, across a lot of different categories of ideas. And I looked at this both using tasks that are verbal idea production tasks, classic types of tasks in psychology research, but also using tasks that were a little bit more real world relevant. For example, a cell phone invention task where you actually had to come up with features for a cell phone. And that was actually a study that was right around the time the first iPhone came out. And so what's great is I love to look back at people's responses, because some of the ideas that people in the ADHD group came up with, others at the time, and this was around 2005-ish, people would say, oh, what, you could never do that. And now we have it. So people would say, you could maybe build in a scanner, or you could have a something with a location tracker in a cell phone. And when I had the raters rate these things for originality, but also, the practicality, I did like the idea that some of these things were simply not appreciated in their time, but we have them now. And it's just really funny to see some of these different things come out now. And so people who were thinking outside of what there is. And when I said to being constrained by what's already out there, I would say that at the time of this study, people were subscribing to these plans for cell phones where you were able to call within a small circle of friends. You got to pick a top 5 or top 10 friends and dial for free. Or you had a camera, which at the time was a very simple camera, had low megapixels. Well, some of the people who were generating ideas that were a little less creative were simply changing those things. So they would say, oh, my cell phone will have the ability to call 15 to 20 people unlimited, or it will have a camera that is X, thing, and then so that it's really, they were developing existing ideas, which isn't to say that they were poor quality responses, but they weren't very exciting. And some of the things that the people with ADHD would come up with would be just a very funny, whimsical and funny, and may or may not be practical, but they definitely had that original edge. I still remember one, and I don't know if this is a feature or not, but when they said, well, these new cell phones, I think they could have a GPS or a location tracker. So they said, my phone will have a feature where your GPS, the location tracker will work together with your alarm clock so that your alarm will not turn off or snooze until the phone is a distance of 12 or 20 feet away from you. And if the phone moves at a certain acceleration, it won't work. So their idea was just, you can't accidentally oversleep for class by pressing snooze, 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 because you'd have to get up and walk across the room to disable it. And you can just chuck your phone across the room, because that wouldn't work either. And I thought it's fun, the sort of playfulness of ideas, and someone might think, oh, what, but the task said, come up with cell phone features that would appeal to college students. This is your target audience, and let's see what would be, attractive too. And so an impractical idea, although creative, in the sense of original was one where it said your phone could be used to project a hologram of yourself in class, so you could sleep in while your hologram came and took notes and etc. So no, it was a fun study, and it really gave you an idea of some of the playfulness of the ideas. And as I went further with this line of research, I wanted to explore maybe both the mechanisms underlying creative behavior in ADHD, but also what sorts of contexts this would express in. So I did find that there are, in many different endeavors, not necessarily in specific domains like art or music, you do tend to see a higher degree of expression in those areas with ADHD, but it isn't to say that everyone with ADHD is going to have above average artistic ability or this or that, the other, but will have a tendency to produce ideas that tend to be more original simply because they are going to be produced in an idea space that's a little more chaotic, a little less censored. And the other thing is there's a tendency to incorporate a lot of the immediate surroundings and contexts into the idea. So where somebody who's more focused might have an idea space in their head and they'd be working on their computer and staying focused, a person with ADHD might be doing something similar and be distracted by what's outside their window or what just happened over here. And they somehow incorporate all of those ideas in and sort of gives nuance to the product, or they will have an intruding thought. This is example I know from my research where people will say, well, my mind was wandering and I know this had nothing to do with anything, but this idea about some other thing that I had to do came into mind and I thought, wait, what if I combine this and that and the other? And it was just kind of a very indirect pathway, but it landed on a very unique idea that was high quality. So it's almost a bit of an accidental pathway, but you tend to see the criteria that is something original and something new and breakthrough type of thing, and something that's an idea that maybe doesn't conform to standards. That seems to be a big thing that is an advantage in ADHD thinking. So my idea is just a lot of the characteristics of ADHD that can be problematic in some contexts. The flip side of some of these things is they just do happen to be conducive to some of the thought processes that give rise to original creative thinking. And so it isn't necessarily saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. It is what it is. There's the same things that are going to help somebody focus and keep their ideas in a narrow space are not necessarily conducive to expanding the idea space and getting lots of new ideas. And so one thing too that I was very interested in is this first I had said too that the individuals with ADHD, my later research suggests, are less constrained by existing products. And one of the things they talk about in innovation is the fixation effect. It's a design fixation, that sort of thing, where if you show people examples of products, it's very difficult for them to not incorporate elements of those products into their design. And it really can constrain the idea space and make it nearly impossible to activate other ideas. So again, this being a constraining influence, I thought this might be less a problem for someone with ADHD. And I did that research and found, in fact, that when someone is coming up with new examples or new product names or new examples of a fictional product, the people with ADHD are less likely to incorporate any elements of those examples into their work. And
I think I read that research, and yes. I don't know if I've got it exactly right, but one of the examples I found really interesting was groups were asked to come up with new pain medication. Right. And they were given examples of existing products like Tylenol, Panadol, yes. Right. And then they were asked to come up with new versions. Right. What was the result there? Well, in that particular example, you have the idea would be giving them lots of examples that had a similar characteristic. And in that set of pain relievers, you have the all, like the Tylenol, Midol, the OL ending. And so it's very difficult for people, even when you say, do not use any aspects of the examples in your labels, but do make the label descriptive of the product. And that's a difficult task to do, because many times the name itself does suggest what the product does. So what I found is that
in that particular task, just doing a simple count of the elements of the task examples that were present in people's designs, the ADHD group was far less likely to incorporate elements of those examples into their product label names. And yet the groups were equal in terms of how descriptive these labels were of the product. And the way that this is done generally is I don't score these things. These things are scored by trained researchers who look independently at these different elements. So there's not any bias. And of course, they don't know who's been diagnosed and who's not been diagnosed. And they also wouldn't know whether this, what type of label, just they'd say, well, is this, what type of a product might this be? Is it a pain reliever? Is it this? Is it that? So based on that, it was interesting to see that the ADHD group was simply less constrained in their ideas. They were able to veer away from, not affected or held back by the pre-existing labels. And so that was kind of a fun one. And I thought, with respect to expanding idea space and constraining examples, it led to some of my more recent work. Well, actually very recent, hot off the press and not quite out there yet, but I was very interested to see if people who are, we say, neuroatypical, like for example, have ADHD or something that makes them think differently, if they are in a conversation or brainstorming group with others who are what we call neurotypical, so basically someone without ADHD, would that person who has these creative outside the box ideas have an influence on the creative processes of someone who doesn't have ADHD? And I was inspired by a study among children that said sometimes when you have a child with ADHD in the playground group, the stories of the other kids seem more creative. And I thought, well, what would happen, if I did this? And so I did a study where I had people do a classic divergent thinking task, which is to come up with ideas or creative uses for an everyday object, like a brick or a bucket or a sock. And in this design, depending on the group that people were in, I gave them examples for that object that were culled from a previous group of people with ADHD or people without ADHD, and said, for example, here you have the object brick, and you could maybe build a house, or you could build a fence, or you could build a school or something like that. And that might be the ones that are most frequent in the typical sample. And then I say, and now add your own to this list. In another group might be given something like some of the ones that were more frequent in the ADHD sample, which would be things like use it to heat, or use it as like a heating brick, like basically heat it up and then use it to warm your hands, a hand warmer, or use it as a press to put on, like a panini maker, like put it on your food, just kind of all over the place ideas. And again, this study was inspired by a study that said engineers are less affected by other people's products, or less constrained in group brainstorming if you expose them to some of the ideas that are kind of outside of what they would think of spontaneously. So it's almost like you're stretching somebody's thought processes and activating them. And I am still actually doing the data analyses for this, but I will give you just a little bit of a teaser so far. It does seem to be that people who are seeing these examples of people with ADHD, in their own responses, they are producing ideas that fall into a greater number of categories. And that is a big factor for divergent thinking, because it does suggest a quality of thinking that's expansive. So if I were to say, for brick, again, I'll say, if I were to just give you things like build a school, build a church, build a fence, at some point it's like, all right, we can build things with a brick, got it. And that would be a single category, essentially building. But a person might say something like, use it to raise the level of water in the toilet tank, or use it to as a stopper if you're working on your car to keep the wheels from coming back, like a wheel chalk thing, or use it as a stencil, or use it as a press. These would be all very different uses, different categories of uses as well. So it suggests this sort of stretching. And what takes a little longer for the data analysis is to examine the originality of each idea within the big sample. So that's what I'm currently doing. My hypothesis is that you will also see more original ideas associated with the people who have been exposed to the more original examples, and that does not include reusing any of those. That those are not options. This study also includes measures of in individual differences in creative style. There's an instrument, I don't know if you've heard of Foresight creative thinking profile, that's used a lot of times in corporate sort of context where people are identified in terms of their predominant preference for different types of creative approaches or problem-solving styles. And to some extent, I think there may be an interaction between somebody's primary approach and how they are going to do creatively when exposed to different types of examples. So somebody who is already a brainstormer may become more or less activated by very original ideas. Other types of creative profiles might be things like a person who really wants to get to the end point of the problem-solving process, someone called an implementer, someone who says, okay, these are great ideas, let's get them off the drawing board and get into motion. The people who are on the front end of a creative problem-solving process are called clarifiers. And they're the ones who were not interested really in coming up with a lot of ideas. They want to clarify the problem space. So those are the people who, in the context of a group, say, okay, wait a minute, let's back up here. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? They really want to clarify it before they jump to the ideas. So you may have the people who are the brainstormers or ideators. Then the next group are the developers, the people who say, oh, you got a lot of ideas here, but hang on, this one's not going to work for this reason. This one's not going to work for this reason. And then the last would be, as I said, those implementers. Let's just get it going. And so that tool has been used successfully a lot in industry and such, because you can really work with that to enrich teams and to create these sort of approaches where you have lots of different people coming in with their strengths and complementing one another's approach. So I included that into this research to see too if this had a practical application, but it's not necessarily as simple as just throwing people who are neurotypical into the mix and seeing if you activate ideas, although predominantly I think that will be the case, but it may be more or less of an effect depending on other people's creative approach and style. And I guess it's in a broader context, I think where I'm going with a lot of this neurodiversity research is just thinking about that when it comes to innovation. I mean, certainly there's a lot of competition, and it's important that each group or entity is coming up with something that is going to have an edge. And yet, if you think about how we're organized in terms of human beings, and we're social, we're not kind of these isolated people. We each have sets of strengths, and rather than saying to any one individual, you need to be good at every part of creativity, from clarifying the idea space to coming up with ideas to refining those ideas, instead we'll say, well, some of these processes that allow us to generate ideas, like not being censored, those are not always going to lead to the most practical ideas. So within an actual applied context or building a team for a different project, it's so helpful to have all these different ingredients so that people can really play off each other's strengths and come up with something, as well as activating those abilities in themselves. But I think that's how you get to the absolute gems of creative innovation, where they are high on every element, from hitting all of the different ideas that you need initially, all the different, I guess you would say, all of the different criteria that somebody's looking for on the front end and to make something useful, but also a lot of rich idea space full of things, including things that are just completely uncensored or ridiculous, but then having that filtered down so that the ideas that are the most useful are then selected, and then getting the thing off and running and getting that timing element right, because of course the timing is everything with all of these ideas. So really, I think the more that we know about how people are approaching things creatively and differently, then we can think about how this doesn't have to be at the level of one single human being. It would be a collection, a small group of human beings that when they're working together can create an amazing result. And sometimes it's like cooking, right? It's a question of the ingredients that you use. You don't want to overemphasize any one element. And people with ADHD, they just tend to be overall fitting into the brainstormer. They tend to be the ideators. They come up with lots and lots of great ideas and lots of junk ideas. And so if they come up with a lot, it's almost better to say, just let it happen instead of shutting someone down and saying, oh, those are not good ideas. Don't think like that. It's so much better to get them all out there and then have that pile of stuff to sift through in a separate process. Because the brain can't both activate and shut down simultaneously. So either the same person does it in steps or a team does it together.
Absolutely. I find it fascinating, this research, which seems to show that creativity really is contagious. If you are of one sort of thinking style and you get exposed to a different one, that can impact yours as well. I also found it very interesting listening to you, how inhibition really does seem to impact creativity very directly. And some of my other favorite studies around improvisation, where people getting put in a brain scanner seem to shut down the very advanced and very highly evolved parts of the brain which censor ourselves and inhibit ourselves. This seems to give more credence to the idea that less inhibition leads to more originality and more creativity.
Absolutely. In fact, they do call this network, or the default mode network, is what operates when we're not thinking and we're not using those higher order processes. So when we say in the brain scanners or such, you see sometimes when people are slipping into this sort of mind wandering mode, they call it default network. They've actually also dubbed it the imagination network, because that is where you get this rich soup of ideas and all kinds of interactions and spontaneity and all the fresh stuff that makes innovation and the new part of it. That is something that is kind of a given by definition for ADHD, because you do have a tendency to have difficulty controlling the activation of that imagination network. And of course, that means it can be distractible and there's a lot of negatives, but at the same time, the fact is you get a lot of original collisions. And so you do tend to see an originality, uniqueness in the thought processes of these. And it does tend to have that contagious effect, to the sense that people like loosen up, almost like, oh, it's okay to do that. Or as I mentioned earlier in our conversation about, say, product design, when one company comes up with something that's radically different and others kind of jump on board, and it's almost as though they got an invitation to do so. Like suddenly it's okay to do this, instead of thinking, well, it was okay all along. And many times we make these assumptions that are not true, and that really limits our ability to be innovative, because these are, and again, they're not conscious, which is a big part of the limitation. Nobody's saying, well, I'm not constraining myself, I'm opening myself to all possibilities. But that's rarely the case. Before we're even aware that we're shutting down processes, we're shutting down processes. And sometimes when you see some of the responses of these individuals with ADHD, they can be shocking. And that sometimes reminds that, okay, there are things you're shutting down, because I would not have come up with that one. But that is what needs to happen to have the raw material that then you sift through and work through. And that is something that you can learn. Though people who, you can be exposed to someone who's very diverse like that, or you could, in fact, cultivate that in yourself. There's certain environments that are very conducive to that divergent thinking, and just allowing yourself to, as soon as you feel like, no, that's not going to work, well, what if it could? Or engaging in situations where you said, but what if that was not the case? Or little things like, I would say sometimes just silly exercises, like saying, what if my big toe suddenly developed consciousness? And it's like, oh, that's absurd, of course. Yeah, but what if? What would it think? It might think, wow, I'm the big toe. That's pretty cool, And if I were the little toe, I might feel a little inferior, or the middle toe might feel left out, and you're just playful. But what happens is, the more times you take a situation that is not, it wouldn't happen, and you play with it, you're allowing your brain to be free. You're sort of undoing some of those bindings, and it's a nice way to loosen things up. And then you get into your actual creative innovation.
Perfect. Dr. White, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking with you. I found it incredibly insightful and very helpful. If people want to find out more about you and your work as well, what's the best place they can go to find out more?
Well, I would say the first thing to throw out there, at least that's relevant to this too, is I have a blog with Psychology Today called Chaotic Cognition, where I explore some of these ideas. And as far as, I think right now I'm kind of in transition, I am on our University of Michigan website for some more ideas, but I would invite people also to email me, and I love having conversations about this, so contact directly, and that will work too.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get those links down in the description below. Dr.
Sure.
White, it's been wonderful having you here, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they are backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.